Setting up. Okay, we're live.
Hey.
All right. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. We are Facebook living right now, coming to you on this nice Monday afternoon. I am Jeremy, the Neura dude, and I'm with Dr. Jenn Zahrt, who is coming back again this weekend for a brand new class. We're going to pop that up in a second so you can take a look at it with us, called Writing Your Sky, Narrative Strategies Using Qualitative Time. And we figured we'd just do this spontaneous live stream to talk about it a little bit and get folks, interested and get them to know what's going to be happening and what it's going to be like. And we also will probably have some time for questions. So if you're listening in, we're tuned into the Facebook page. So if you got a question, feel free to just go ahead and type that in the comment stream, because we'll be reading that. So welcome, Jenn.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the class. What is it about? And so there's going to be writing involved, and I'm really excited about that because this is Neura's first writing class, like ever.
Awesome.
So
that's great.
It's an honor to have you be our resident writer in residence to teach us. So.
Awesome. Thank you. This class is a really amazing confluence of a lot of things I've been up to in the last 2 decades of my life. When I started learning astrology, I was basically learning pattern recognition, and my first teacher was really interested in history. So my work with it was looking at past events and seeing recurring patterns through time. And I also taught writing at UC Berkeley when I was in graduate school. So I had a vast experience of, analyzing literature and then helping other people come to realize like what elements make up a certain story. And in my own research for my PhD, I was looking at Germans from 100 years ago, talking about the ways in which astrological cycles can help us understand not only an author's life and when that author might write their best work of fiction, but also inside the fiction itself, the astrology of the work itself. So this kind of was percolating in the cauldron of my mind. And I'm thinking, how do we teach a more qualitative way to look at time that relies on other patterns that are not as common as the patterns that most people who endeavor to write about their lives are aware of? Our society sets up time as in like a month or a week or a day. And these are very apparent times. But if you start to study the movement of the planets and also symbolic movements of the planets, you get to segment time in very different ways. And that allows us to double back and tell different stories, because even when I'm, seeing astrology clients and I'll talk to them about various timings in their life, they'll go, oh, really, actually, that thing 17 years ago really does have an impact on what I'm doing now. And I never thought of that before. So in a way, it's kind of exploring more advanced techniques in astrology based off of planetary motion and symbolic understandings of that motion to help us identify lived experiences that we've had to reframe our story or tease out details that might belong in the story that we've left out because we haven't thought about them in that way. So it's kind of a very sort of sideways way of teaching advanced astrology techniques, but I want the experience to be more of one of personal knowledge, right? So the writing is emphasized, less reading. It's not about reading. It's more about writing through the patterns that I'm going to be presenting and taking a look at our own lives together and starting to also appreciate each other's experiences and get a story-based feeling for what these symbolic patterns of the planets are doing. And after that, when you go back and you might take a class in, actual sort of advanced astrology of, whatever techniques that we're going through, you're going to have a basis of experience because you've read not only your writing, or gone through the process of writing your writing, but you've read other students' contributions. And so you're just going to have this archive of knowledge that's going to be almost like having this direct experience of it. And then learning the kind of technique itself is going to double back and just make you a stronger thinker in all ways. So that's kind of the sort of confluence of all these various things is, learning how to write better, learning how to tease out details that you don't think matter, that actually do matter. And then what happens when you reframe that story? What happens when you incorporate those things or learn how to see time in ways that aren't just this metric and or sort of Mesopotamian 60-faced system,
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like it's taking the abstract and really kind of embodying it in this experiential and meaningful level and dimensionality, right? So I can't think of a better thing to do, a better way to learn than to write into a form of knowledge and knowing, especially self-knowledge. So, and the class begins, just for folks tuning in, on February 3rd. So that's this Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're also going to be releasing sort of an introductory video. It's going to be going through, let's see, that'll be pre-recorded. And when we start with the live sessions on February 3rd and we go through February 24th. So is this a class for anybody? Because I know in the course description, you mentioned that there's no real, you don't need to be an expert on astrology. All beginners are welcome, right? So
That's true.
maybe we could talk a little bit about the primer, and we're hoping to, who should the students be for this? Like
hungry people, people who really want to get their hands dirty in pattern recognition, right? So I'm not saying that this is going to be a class that's going to teach you how to do astrology. What we're going to be talking about is pattern recognition, and all human meaning making is pattern recognition on fundamental level. We speak English, we can iterate that pattern, but we're working with a base set of patterns, right? And as we observe the world as writers, we're also looking for patterns or anomalies in a pattern. The expected pattern, we find an anomaly, we write about that, and then suddenly that delight in that anomaly becomes part of a new pattern, and it takes more anomalies to get back to that delight. So when we're looking at patterns, all the pressure of being an astrologer is taken away. I don't expect anyone to read a chart from this. What we're doing is we're looking at facets of a chart to see how different times link together and unfold certain facets of that chart. So the primer of astrological theory is really going to be introducing the bare minimum of terminology that someone's going to need, so that when I'm speaking in class, there's a sort of knowledge of like, oh, that's what a planet is. That's what a house is. That's what this is. But for all intents and purposes, it's just kind of getting the vocabulary up to speed and just the general concepts up to speed, just enough. But when we get into the 4 sessions, we're talking on February 3rd about transits. We're talking about a certain kind of 12-fold pattern on February 10th. We're talking about a deep pattern on February 17th that I'm calling deep time twins. It's actually secondary progressions for other astrologers who want to sort of use the jargon. But in that way, we're looking at an analogy between 2 measures of time. So you don't need to be an astrologer to understand the analogy between 2 measures of time. That's something that anybody can access. If I say to you that there's an analogy between 3 days after you were born and 3 years after you were born, and you start rooting through your baby files and find that you were in the newspaper 3 days after you were born because you did something fantastic, and then 3 years after you were born, you ended up being, the sort of child star of whatever ballet class your mom enrolled you in. It's kind of, you can see these resonances over time, and so you don't actually need to be the astrologer in that way. It's learning how the patterns work to start to identify the way time works in other ways and start to bring other elements together. Especially that February 17th class is going to unlock a lot of potential for people who are interested in more sci-fi explorations and kind of seeing the human experience. There's kind of sometimes this fantasy of, what if we're all one consciousness fractaled and we're appreciating each other? This is a technique that really gets you down into that, like, oh my gosh, wow, what about that, and it's kind of hard to discuss without giving you an example. And that's partly why we're spending a whole class on it, is to just go through various examples of experiencing this fractal consciousness. And on February 24th, to round it out, the zones of intensity is going to cover a ancient Greek technique known in the industry as zodiacal releasing. But really what we're looking at is an unfoldment of someone's creative potential and zones of intensity where they're able to actually act on that creative potential, and also moments where that creative potential completely flips the table and a new opportunity is open to them. And this has a regular pattern. I've actually designed software with my friend Kent Bai, who I think is contributing to your anthology Mutations. And we created this user interface to look at this patterning. It almost looks like I had this other sort of side project. I wanted to make Doctor Who scarf out of the pattern. So the Time Lord shifts on a Time Lord. I thought that would be kind of, really cool.
That's amazing.
So I'm going to be going through basically step by step, looking at this regular pattern of human unfoldment that has been lost to us today. And if you start to get underneath the hood of that, all kinds of things make sense in the world. And also, even if you're just coming to class for yourself, looking at your own data and seeing that map of your own creative potential, you're going to start to be able to link together certain periods of life and certain qualities of time and certain emotional realities of time, and understand, oh my gosh, that is why 1987 felt exactly like 1992. And I think that's a very important thing for growing as observers of the world, growing as writers, and also healing from some of the stuff that was kind of ucky from the past, and saying, oh,
Mm.
wow, this is sort of how those things link together. And now I can write a different story, or I can incorporate or expand upon, or, embellish, or who knows, there's sort of
Mm.
not knowing. It's like, that's, yeah, why not know? Like, come to class.
Well, I like what you wrote in the description for February 24th. After this module, you'll be able to identify your own creative peaks and use this information to plan out your future work. As a writer, and I think anybody who's doing creative work, that sounds very inviting and enticing to have that kind of knowledge. So
Right.
I'm very excited about learning about that. So maybe even a little bit about that too. In the student learning outcomes, you mentioned that students should expect to develop new strategies for constructing plot, character, and narrative.
Yes.
So this is interesting too, because this kind of leans into, as you mentioned earlier, science fiction. So there's a fictional element here that I think creative types can expect to discover through this class, right? So maybe
Yeah.
we can lean into that a little bit and talk about how is this going to inform perhaps fictional works, fictional
Right.
and narrative and storytelling and so on.
So my main background in my graduate work was actually German literature, which, the keyword being literature, it just happened to be in German. And whenever you study a literature of a foreign tongue, then it's abstract enough that you really are full front and center with the narratology, the study of how narratives are constructed, how certain forms of linguistics are being employed to create the effect of a certain type of story taking place. And I really want to bring that into the class I'm teaching. These are not just astrology classes. This is very much a focus on how are we building the stories that we're telling using certain types of narrative strategy to get across certain effects, right? If we tell a story only in the second person, it's going to feel very different than if we tell it only in the third person. And that's just the surface level of what I'm going to be bringing up. So there's also ways of telling implotment, certain ways in which you can report information without an event actually taking place in the plot or the story. So it's like analyzing how all of those facets come together in looking at how we can bring together all of the data we're mining from the pattern recognition. So it's like, okay, we do pattern recognition, we have all this data. Now, how do we shape that in a way that's going to give the effect of the story we'd like to share, not only about ourselves, which is where we're starting because it's what we know most, but that can be transplanted to anything that you write at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned too that basically the way we're gonna move through the classes, we're gonna focus on memoir first and then fiction second.
Yeah.
So you also have a little caveat here where you mentioned that what we won't be doing, right? We won't address static correspondences between astrological symbolism and narrative techniques. So could you kind of go into that a little bit too?
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of easy, like, one of the first ways people learn astrology is to get keywords for Saturn and apply it to everything. So, for example, I shared an article on Facebook today about Saturn losing its rings. And so some of my astrological colleagues are making jokes about what that might mean using associations and correspondences to Saturn. And so, that is a very simple approach that, is kind of the first route in. I want to take it a step further. I don't want to just sit around diagnosing something. When you diagnose something, you say, this is that. And it's almost like an equal sign. This equals this. There's no movement in there. I'm really interested in dynamic processes and looking at the ways that temporal patterns move. So, when we're talking about an event taking place, ostensibly it takes place in time, and astrology gives us a robust archive of ways to think about time that are the heart and soul of what astrology is. It's qualitative time, understanding the patterns of qualitative time. So beyond just being able to identify Saturn is this, Jupiter is that, Pisces is this, Capricorn is that, I want to actually go deeper and say, the movement of Venus has an 8-year pattern. What does that mean for us, right? And what are the stations along that pattern that are significant? That's what I'm really looking at, is this dynamic process, as opposed to this one-to-one correspondence of that first stage of learning. That's really what's going to be in that primer video. And the other parts are about embracing the dynamic movements, because I think that that's something that's not treated enough. It's very common to look at those first stages and kind of memorize the 12 signs, memorize the 12 houses, and then go to a piece of literature and say, well, this must be the Jupiter character and that must be the Saturn character. And it's like, okay, that's cool. Now, what are they doing? How are they interacting? How would they actually interact in the grand scheme of how the planets move? And or how would this character as a dynamic creature and not just a simple reduction as a Jupiter figure or a Saturn figure have a full life inside of this narrative, right? So I'm trying to get away from reductive movements and from diagnosis. I want to talk about the ways that we can add prognosis in literature, which also brings up a really awesome point for me, which I love thinking about, is prediction in literature. If the book is already written, then the author has written the future of that story. So even though you're reading that story in a linear way, it's written. And so the prediction in the text is sort of a false one, because the book will end and it has an ending that's literally in your hands or on your Kindle e-reader or whatever. But when we're looking at what I'm about to teach, we're looking at patterns in the sky that haven't happened yet, but that are predictable. So we're looking at literally the writing in the sky and learning how to interact with that future position and giving that some shape. So you can think about prediction in literature, and it's always a retrograde thing. The book is always printed in the past. Even if you read it in the future, what's said is said, and it doesn't shift. And yet what we're looking at with astrology as a practice and the data that we get out of it, knowing that planets are going to be in certain positions in the future, is this chance to engage with the future and then write into the future in ways that simply appreciating writing about the future can't quite give us, if that makes sense.
That makes sense to me, and it's very exciting. It's just the way you're framing it is really interesting, because essentially, if I understand you right, it's empowering the individual to self-create. That you're leaning into the future in an intuitive and a virtual sense, and then you're fleshing it out, knowing what's coming, but not having it set in stone. And so there's all the creativity and narrative creativity that can happen through that, both personally and also through the storytelling. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. And you can take that pattern recognition of the past, saying last time this happened, this was going on. And when it happens again, here are the variables that change. What can I imagine might take place there?
Yes.
And in that way, you don't necessarily need to become like a professional astrologer. You can simply be partaking of the human cultural heritage of learning information from the sky about what might come to pass in a qualitative way based on your lived experience.
And so maybe we can get into, since we've just got a few more minutes here, in terms of the student experience, folks who are going to be taking this, there's a class portal, Neuro hosts class portal, where you have all the information that you need. And then there's also a class forum where students are going to be invited to participate by uploading some of their journals, their narratives, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and what students are expected to engage with during this class.
So I'm open to lurkers, just to put that out there. So if you're very, very busy and you don't feel like writing and you just want to get the sort of insight on some advanced astrological insights, that's fine. Come to class, it's great. It doesn't matter. But I'm hoping to have an active body of students who will submit their 2,000 word reflections by Wednesday. And then we'll have from Wednesday to Sunday to give each other feedback or react to each other or appreciate each other, and sort of, and I'll do some nipping and tucking and sort of time surgery to sort of course correct if I see somebody applying what I've taught in a way that isn't quite right. I'll sort of say, actually, what about this or that? And but it's less about sort of, we're all adults, this is sort of a sort of joyous gathering of let's sharpen our minds together. So I see myself more as a sort of facilitator of, getting people kind of in the right place and sharing what I know about these patterns in the sky and helping everybody kind of grow as writers together. And I think the participation is going to be critical, because even the exercise of just going through your own narrative and writing that down, when you start to see it compared to others, it builds this archive of knowledge that really, really starts to show you how this works with other people and or how it doesn't work. And that's also an open question. As we see these ancient patterns coming to us, there's this assumption that they should work, but sometimes they don't. And when they break, I find that very interesting. And that's also worth talking about. Like, why did this malfunction here? And it could just be that we're not seeing clearly enough, or, that we just have to alter our own vantage point. I don't know. So it's all open, but I would imagine, ideally, we have class on Sunday, we upload our words by Wednesday, we have time to digest those and feedback and everything of that nature. And, within that 4-week span, there's just a really nice workshop of getting into your own stuff and imagining possible new projects and really planting seeds for a garden that will grow over time after class is ended.
It's a perfect winter course. Just
Yeah.
planting the seeds and getting ready for new creativity. And I love your description of it in the opening few paragraphs. You're describing it as a personal gnosis, and I really like that word, a personal gnosis, to apply to future memoir projects or other creative writing. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I have a link. If we have a few minutes, if anybody does want to chime in and ask a question, we are live streaming right now, so we are looking at the chat box, so feel free to type anything in and let us know if you have any questions. The link to Writing Your Sky is right there. It's posted in the video box, so definitely take a look at the full description. And maybe I'll pop it up for a moment just so folks can actually just take a look at it with us for a minute or so. Here we go. Did I do it right? Maybe not. One second.
There was a screen share that took place.
Okay, now I think, here we go. So here it is. You can see everything. And so we're starting on February 3rd. As you can see, register button's right here. Please take a look, read through the copy here, engage with it a little bit, meditate on it. Here's our schedule as we were just describing. I love, these all sound so fascinating, especially the deep time twins. I think we all have people like this in our lives, so it's very interesting to kind of think about that and actually kind of have some kind of conceptual model to start thinking about it and applying it to our friendships and connections and everything. So I can think of like 2 or 3 people immediately. So very curious about that session. And then here's some of our student learning outcomes. And there is no, as you mentioned, assigned reading. This is more of an assigned writing. Oh, yeah, maybe probably should mention that too. A minimum of 2,000 words per week. Would you say that that's a very strongly encouraged minimum for?
Yeah, strongly encouraged. Yes. Obviously, I know we're all busy, and so there might be people who want to just sort of listen to the recordings. That's totally fair. I just would say, to get the most out of class and to get what you're actually coming for, a minimum of 2,000 would be good, because sometimes when we begin to write, especially if we haven't considered ourselves writers in a while, which I expect some of you are, getting out the gunk, right? By the time you get past the first 500 words, then you're really in the flow and you can start to put things together, and it kind of challenges your mind to bring in more reflections and considerations. If you only put out the equivalent of a Facebook post worth of reflection on it, you're not really going to get down to the root of it. So I do recommend around 2,000 words, even if the 2,000 words consist of, hey, I looked at it, nothing seemed to fit, but I also saw this, and then go on to that, So,
Excellent.
Yeah, and I'll be very active in the forums as well. So it's not just a matter of like I only light in on Wednesday. It'll be something where I'm constantly in there, and if others have questions or like, hey, I'm looking at this, but I'm having some issues, I'll be right there to help.
Fantastic. And as you can see, here's a little bit more information about what students can expect to get. The class forum is going to be on Discourse. So it's a really great forum software, kind of relatively new. It's not what you think of when you think of internet forum. It's very dynamic and user-friendly. All the recordings are sent to you through email, and they're also available on the class portal. So we're going to also have email reminders, and everything else will be posted on the class portal there, as you can see. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. And let me just see if we have any feedback or questions. We're having some likes. Hi, Jennifer Stickley. Thank you for watching with us.
Hi.
And we look forward to seeing you on the class. And thank you, Jen. This was awesome.
Thanks, Jeremy. I can't wait to get in there. It's going to be super fun.
See you Sunday.
Bye.